My name is Nia. I'm 27 years old, and I was born and raised in Savannah, Georgia, a place where tradition is thick in the air and expectations are even thicker. I've lived my whole life with what doctors call a capillary malformation, but most people just call it a birthmark. It blooms across the right side of my face like a spill of wine on silk, dark red and uneven, textured like the surface of a burn. Some people think it's a scar. Some think it's makeup gone wrong. But most don't ask. They just stare, turn away, or pretend not to see it at all. I've had strangers flinch when I walked into elevators, makeup artists hesitate before touching me, and children ask their parents, loudly, "What's wrong with that girl's face?" I used to try to cover it up. Thick foundations, heavy powders, special effect makeup that promised miracles. But no matter what I did, the shape still showed through, bleeding past every edge. Eventually, I stopped trying to disappear. I shaved my head at 23 to stop hiding behind my hair. I learned to walk into rooms like I had every right to be there, even when I could feel the whispers clinging to the walls behind me. I learned not to wince when people told me I was brave for showing my face. But none of that prepared me for what I heard the day before my cousin's wedding. The rehearsal dinner was at a country club just outside of town, a whitewashed building with glossy floors and more mirrors than windows. Everything about the place felt staged, like it was meant to be remembered in photographs rather than lived in. I had arrived early, hoping to help set the table arrangements or fold napkins, something simple. I wasn't in the bridal party. I hadn't expected to be. My cousin Alana had always been distant, beautiful and polite in that way that makes you feel like a guest in your own family. But she'd invited me, and I thought that meant something. I thought I was included. I thought I belonged. I was in the hallway outside the dressing room when I heard it. Their voices were muffled at first, laughter spilling over each other like champagne. I wasn't eavesdropping. I was just passing by. Then one of them said it. Her voice cut through the air like glass. Sharp, clean, casual. She said if Nia was coming, someone better tell the photographer to keep her out of the shots. Then she laughed and added with a kind of effortless cruelty that no bride wants a red-stained face in her wedding album. I froze. The hallway suddenly felt too narrow, the air too thick. My chest tightened, not from surprise, but from recognition. This wasn't the first time someone had said something like that about me. It wasn't even the worst, but it was the first time I heard it in a place where I thought I was safe. A place where I was supposed to be family. I pressed my back against the wall, heart pounding. Not from anger, but from something quieter. Something more dangerous. I felt ashamed. Not because of what I looked like, but because I had allowed myself to believe, even for a moment, that I was finally past this. That I had done enough, grown enough, hardened enough to stop being a target. I stood there until their voices faded into another room. I didn't cry. I didn't storm in. I didn't announce myself. I just kept breathing, one inhale at a time, while my fingers trembled against the seam of my dress. I walked back to the parking lot without saying a word, the laughter still echoing in my ears. When I got home that night, I stared at myself in the mirror for a long time. Not with hatred. Not even with sadness. Just with a cold, clear stillness. I traced the edges of the mark across my cheek and tried to imagine how many times someone had wished it away from me. My mother, when I was a baby. My teachers, when we took class photos. My friends, when they introduced me to new people. Myself, so many nights I'd lost count. But this time I didn't wish. I just stood there, watching. A face they didn't want in the frame. And for the first time in a long time, I started to ask myself what would happen if I stepped into the frame anyway. The morning after the rehearsal dinner, I opened my inbox out of habit. It was early, and the house was still wrapped in that strange kind of silence that only exists before the rest of the world has caught up. I wasn't expecting anything. Maybe a schedule update or a reminder from the hospital. But instead, there it was, an email from the wedding coordinator. The subject line read, "Final headcount confirmation." I clicked it without thinking, expecting to see the usual polite logistics. What I saw instead was a spreadsheet, neatly formatted and numbered, with RSVP statuses and seating arrangements. I scanned down the guest list, eyes moving faster and faster until I realized I wasn't on it. My name wasn't there, not misspelled, not accidentally duplicated, not misplaced under a married version, just not there. Like I had never existed. At first I thought it was a mistake, a simple clerical error. These things happen, right? So I called Alana, straight to voicemail. I texted her. No response. I waited a few hours, then tried my aunt, her mother. She picked up, sounded distracted, said she was in the middle of something. I asked gently if she knew anything about the guest list. She hesitated. Then she said, in the soft, practiced voice of someone trying to sound neutral, that it had been decided I'd sit this one out. Her words, "sit this one out," landed like a slap. Like I was being benched. Like a player who wasn't good enough to represent the team. She said it wasn't personal. That the planning had become stressful, and Alana needed everything to go smoothly. That photos were a big part of the day, and the photographer had a very specific style. That they were trying to create something aesthetic. Then she added that she hoped I'd understand, that this didn't mean I wasn't loved. I thanked her, numbly, and hung up. I didn't cry. Not immediately. I just sat on the edge of my bed, holding my phone in my hand like it might turn warm and give me another answer. I tried to remember every moment over the last few months that might have hinted at this. Every silence, every fake smile, every passive-aggressive compliment. I thought about how carefully Alana had avoided eye contact during family dinners, how no one had asked what I'd be wearing to the ceremony, how no one had included me in the group chats about decorations and playlists and color palettes. The signs had always been there. I just didn't want to see them. When the tears finally came, they weren't loud. They fell quietly, running down the side of my face like the mark I'd carried since birth. Unasked for. Constant. Unavoidable. I didn't cry because I wasn't going to the wedding. I cried because someone had looked at my face, my literal skin, and decided that it wasn't worth the risk of ruining a photograph, because they had called it a distraction, because they had spoken about me like a stain on the fabric of their perfect day. I imagined the photos they wanted, clean, soft, white tablecloths and pastel bouquets and smiling, symmetrical people, a bride with no blemishes, a family with no evidence of difference. I didn't belong in that frame. Not because I didn't love them, but because they had decided love had to come with conditions. And I didn't meet them. For a moment, I considered staying quiet, letting it go. There was still time to bow out gracefully, to pretend I had chosen not to come. But then I remembered the voice in the hallway the day before. The one that laughed. The one that said I shouldn't be there. And something shifted inside me. A small, sharp defiance. They had erased my name from a list, but they hadn't erased my voice, and I wasn't done being seen. It came the morning of the wedding. I was sitting on the edge of my bed, half-dressed, with my shoes untouched on the floor, and a steaming mug of untouched coffee cooling beside me. My phone buzzed once. I glanced at it, expecting something like a last-minute update or a cancellation notice. Maybe even a message from Alana. A small part of me, still clinging to some deeply buried thread of hope, thought it could be her saying she'd changed her mind. That I should come. That she wanted me there after all. that I mattered. But it wasn't from her. It was from the wedding photographer. The name wasn't familiar, but I recognized the email address. He was the same one who'd done my cousin's engagement shoot, the one with the bright, washed-out edits and perfectly symmetrical couples laughing in golden fields. The subject line was short. Quick question, attendance. The body of the message was longer. Too long, in fact. You could always tell when someone was trying too hard to sound polite, to soften the blow. It was wrapped in professionalism, padded with praise. But underneath it all, the message was unmistakable. He had been given the final guest list and noticed that I wasn't on it. But there was, apparently, a chance I might still attend. He wanted to reach out proactively, as he put it, just to clarify a few things. He said he was very experienced with large events, and that lighting, symmetry, and focus were essential to the visual cohesion of the day. He said that when working with visibly unique features, especially facial ones, it was important to prepare ahead of time so adjustments could be made in framing and post-production. Then he wrote the sentence that made my breath catch, the one I read 3 times before the meaning settled in. In certain situations, unanticipated visual elements can inadvertently distract from the focal subject of a shot. I stared at that line for a long time. Unanticipated visual elements. I wondered if he had practiced the phrase before typing it, if he had hesitated and hovered his fingers over the keyboard before deciding it sounded neutral enough. It wasn't. It wasn't neutral. It was precise. It was surgical. I was the unanticipated element, the unpredictable variable in his perfectly balanced equation of light, linen, and love. I didn't respond. What could I say? That I understood? That I forgave him for dressing up rejection in pixels and politeness? That I was sorry my face might ruin someone's frame? My fingers hovered over the keyboard for a long time, but I closed the screen without typing a word. I didn't delete the message. I left it there, unread in my inbox, glowing like a quiet wound. I thought back to the times I had been cropped out of pictures growing up. School photos where the lighting accidentally caught my face at a bad angle. Family vacation shots where I stood just out of frame. Group selfies where the poster claimed they couldn't find one where everyone looked good. But somehow, my absence was the solution. I had spent years learning how to lean out, how to tilt my head just so, how to smile smaller so the attention didn't fall on me. I had become an expert in my own disappearance. But this time was different. This time it wasn't passive. It was formal, anticipated. He had reached out in advance, not to make accommodations, not to welcome, not to understand, but to gently remind me that my presence was not neutral, that it came with complications, that it was a problem best avoided. I looked at myself in the mirror again, my dress laid out behind me, untouched. My scalp smooth, my face uncovered, the mark blooming across my cheek in its full, unfiltered truth. I thought of all the hours I had spent trying to fade it, all the products, all the shame, all the apologies that weren't mine to make, and I realized something. This wasn't about a photo. It never had been. It was about control, about narrative, about the curated beauty of a day that demanded everything be perfect, even if it meant asking someone like me to be invisible. They weren't just trying to exclude me from the celebration. They were trying to edit me out of the memory entirely. But I had lived every day with this face. I had survived every glance, every whispered insult, every backhanded compliment and flinching handshake. I had built my life around a face that people wanted to forget. And now, on the day they wanted me gone, I had a choice: to fade or to arrive. I sat in my car with the engine off, parked just outside the venue. The air was thick and still, the kind of late afternoon heat that stuck to your skin and made the inside of a vehicle feel like a confession booth. My dress clung to the backs of my legs. I hadn't moved in 20 minutes. I had arrived too early, or maybe too late. I wasn't sure anymore. The ceremony was starting soon, and inside that carefully decorated building were faces I had known my entire life. People who had celebrated birthdays and graduations with me, who had hugged me out of obligation, who had said things like, "We're family," but somehow never meant me. The kind of people who smiled with their mouths but not with their eyes. The kind who had, over the years, learned to avoid staring at the right side of my face and instead simply looked past me altogether. I gripped the steering wheel with both hands, not to drive, not to steady myself, just because I didn't know what else to hold on to. My palms were slick. My heart had settled into that slow, deliberate pace it took on when it was preparing for something hard. I stared through the windshield at the entrance, at the white doors framed by flowers, at the shimmer of pastel dresses moving past the windows. I could see shadows of people arriving, laughter and movement behind glass. I tried to imagine walking through those doors and being seen, truly seen, not as a cousin, not as a guest, but as the disruption they had tried so carefully to avoid. Every part of me told me to stay in the car. It would be easier, cleaner. No one had expected me to come. I had no seat assigned, no name on a card. If I left now, they could pretend I'd simply decided not to show up, that it had been my choice all along. No confrontation, no scandal, just one less distraction in their perfect frame. I could go home, order takeout, watch a movie I'd seen before, wrap myself in silence and pretend it didn't hurt. But something kept me there. Maybe it was the silence. Maybe it was the message from the photographer still burning in the back of my mind. Maybe it was the voice of my mother asking me to understand the situation. Maybe it was the memory of the laughter in the hallway, the way they had spoken about me like I was a problem to solve, not a person to love. Maybe it was the years I'd spent shrinking myself, learning how to take up less space in rooms, how to disappear before anyone asked me to. Or maybe it was the weight of everything I'd already endured, pressing against my spine, daring me not to walk away one more time. I looked at myself in the rearview mirror. My face was flushed from the heat. The birthmark on my cheek looked darker than usual, stretched and alive. My head was bare, my earrings simple. No makeup, no mask, just me, raw, present. I didn't look like a threat, but I didn't look invisible either. And I realized that this wasn't about making them comfortable anymore. It wasn't about proving anything. It wasn't even about being accepted. It was about being seen exactly as I was, without apology. It was about reclaiming the space they had tried to withhold. Not by demanding it. Just by stepping into it, I opened the door. The heat hit me like a wall, but I welcomed it. I walked, slowly to the entrance, each step deliberate, like I was anchoring myself to the moment. I could feel the nerves rising again, crawling up my throat, but I didn't stop. I reached the door and paused. Behind it were people who didn't want me there. Behind it were whispers waiting to happen, eyes waiting to glance away. But also behind it was the truth of who I was, and the decision that I would no longer be the one to flinch first. I took a breath, and I walked in. She called later that night, after the sun had gone down and the silence in my apartment had begun to feel like it was pressing inward. Her name lit up my phone screen, and for a moment, I just stared at it. I knew exactly what the call would be. She never called unless something needed to be cleaned up. My mother had always seen herself as the negotiator in the family, the calm in the storm, the one who kept things from getting messy. That was her language. Mess, clean, fix. She had a way of dressing cruelty in calmness, of turning rejection into something that sounded reasonable. I answered on the fourth ring. Her voice was light, almost too bright, like she was trying to pretend nothing unusual had happened. She asked how I was, said she'd heard things were a little tense. around the wedding, that there had been some communication mishaps. I didn't say anything at first, just listened, letting her fill the silence with practiced pleasantries. Then she got to the point. She said she didn't want a scandal. That was the word she used. Scandal. Like my presence, my face, my skin, my body might become the headline at someone else's celebration. She said the day wasn't about me, that weddings were stressful enough without extra complications. She reminded me that people would be emotional, that they wouldn't understand, that they might say things without thinking, that it would be better for everyone if I just sat this one out. She said it wasn't personal. It was about protecting peace, about letting things go, about being mature. She told me she knew I was strong, and that strength meant knowing when to step back. Then she asked me to understand the situation, to not take it the wrong way, to be gracious. I could hear the implication in her voice, the quiet edge beneath the softness. She wasn't asking me for understanding. She was telling me to disappear quietly, to be the daughter who knew how not to make a scene, to be the kind of woman who let others erase her with a smile. I felt my throat tighten, but I didn't let the heat in my chest spill out. I had learned, long ago, not to cry during her calls. My tears had never moved her. They only made her sound more rational, more composed, more right. I let her speak, let her say all the things she needed to say to feel like the problem had been managed. And when she finally paused, I told her I understood. Not because I did, but because I knew she needed to hear it. When the call ended, I sat in the dark and stared at the ceiling. A scandal. That's what I was now. A potential disruption to an aesthetic, an unpredictable variable in a tightly controlled image. I wasn't a person to them in that moment. I was a threat to their narrative. I thought of all the times she had asked me to understand before, when kids at school whispered about my face, and she told me to ignore them, when relatives suggested I sit on the edge of family photos, and she called it just a better angle, when makeup artists at department stores hesitated to touch my skin, and she laughed it off like they were being overly cautious. She had always asked me to understand, to be patient, to forgive, to accept the spaces where I was not welcome. And, for so long, I had tried. I had smiled when it hurt. I had excused what should never have been said. I had swallowed my own grief to make others more comfortable. But that night, something settled in me. Not like a burden, but like a choice. I would not rage. I would not beg. I would not argue with people who had already decided what I was worth in their story, but I would not disappear. Not this time. The next morning, I sat in front of the mirror with every product I owned spread out across the bathroom counter. Bottles, compacts, brushes, sponges, all of it lined up like tiny weapons, lined up for battle against something that wouldn't move. The wedding was in a few hours, and I still hadn't made a decision. I told myself I just wanted to see, just wanted to experiment, just wanted to have the option. But I knew what I was doing. I was trying to erase myself, piece by piece, just enough to slip into their picture without protest. The foundation was heavy, full coverage, long wear, water-resistant, the kind used by drag queens and actors under stage lights. I had spent too much money on it years ago during a brief phase of believing I could blend my skin into something acceptable if I just tried hard enough. I hadn't touched it in months. It had started to separate in the bottle, and I had to shake it for a full minute before it mixed again. The first streak across my cheek felt cold, wet, foreign. I used a sponge to dab it in, then patted more over the edges, layering it until the texture blurred into something smoother. It didn't look like skin. It looked like a mask. But that was the point, wasn't it? Still, the mark wouldn't vanish. The red beneath bled through like a secret that refused to stay buried. No matter how thick the product, no matter how precise, my hand, it peeked through in shades of pink and rust. I tried color corrector next, green, then yellow, then peach. Nothing worked. It only made the area look bruised, irritated, like I'd tried to sand it off and failed. I stared at myself for a long time. My left side looked unnaturally matte, almost doll-like, smooth in a way that didn't belong to a real face. My right side looked like mine, raw, complicated, alive. I tilted my head back and forth under the light, watching the two halves of myself struggle to agree on a single identity. There was no middle, no version of me that could exist entirely within someone else's comfort zone. My hands were sticky with product. The sponge was soaked. My eyes burned from how long I had been squinting. I could hear my mother's voice in the back of my mind, telling me to be presentable, to not make a statement. I could hear my cousin's laughter, echoing down that hallway, reminding me I wasn't the aesthetic they wanted. And I could hear my own voice, quieter than the rest, asking why I was doing this again. Why I was still trying to shrink for people who had already decided I didn't belong. I tried again. One more layer, one more swipe. It looked better for a second. Almost acceptable, almost invisible. But then I turned slightly, and the light hit just right, and there it was again, that red gleam. The mark I'd carried since birth, the thing I used to cry about in the dark. The thing I used to think I would give anything to remove. The thing that had come to define every first impression, every judgment, every silence. I wiped the makeup off in one motion. My hand trembled as I did it. It felt violent. Not because I was angry, but because I was done. The tissue came away thick with color, stained with beige and green and memory. I scrubbed at my cheek with a damp cloth until my skin burned. Until I was pink with friction and heat. Until I looked like myself again. I looked in the mirror and saw the face they didn't want at their wedding. The face they thought would ruin their photos. And for the first time in a long time, I let myself feel the grief of that. Not the anger, though it was there, buried deep, but the sorrow. The quiet ache of knowing that no matter how kind I was, how polite, how quiet or generous or dignified, it would always come back to this, to skin, to surface, to something I never asked for and never tried to use against anyone, something that just existed. Because I did, the towel slipped from my shoulder as I stood. My hands were still shaking. My breath came in short bursts, but I wasn't crying. I was too tired to cry. I looked at my reflection one last time and didn't speak. I just nodded, barely, like I was finally choosing a side. I would go as I was. Or I wouldn't go at all. The room was already dimmed when I stepped through the doorway. The kind of low lighting that made everything feel more intimate than it actually was. The air inside was heavy with perfume and candle wax, and the silence was too perfect, choreographed, like every tablecloth and wine glass. A man in a black suit stood at the microphone with a champagne flute in his hand, offering a toast to the happy couple. Laughter rolled softly across the tables like fog, practiced and smooth, the kind of sound people make when they know they're being watched. No one noticed me at first. I wasn't supposed to be there. I had no seat, no escort, no smile fixed, in place. But I walked in anyway, each step like a bell rung in reverse, pulling heads toward me one by one. There was no music, no announcement, no spotlight, just the sound of my shoes on the hardwood floor and the weight of their collective, attention beginning to shift. It started with one camera, a soft click from the far corner of the room, then another, then a flash. I felt it before I understood it. That sudden, unmistakable sensation of being in the center of the frame, of becoming the thing no one could pretend not to see. Heads turned. Conversations broke. The man with the microphone paused mid-sentence. People turned in their chairs and leaned forward, eyes wide not with horror, but with recognition. I had expected whispers. I had expected gasps or long, slow blinks of discomfort. But what I hadn't expected was the silence. The breathless, charged stillness that filled the room the moment I stepped fully into view. My dress moved around my legs like smoke. My face was bare, my mark illuminated by the soft gold light from a chandelier overhead. It caught the contours of my cheek like a deliberate design, not a flaw. And then the flashes came again, one after another, quick, deliberate. From phones, from the hired photographer, from people I hadn't even realized were holding cameras. No one had told them to stop. No one shielded their lenses. They just kept clicking, like their fingers had moved before their minds could catch up. I didn't say anything. I just stood there. A few guests began to shift uncomfortably in their seats, not out of judgment, but because the moment had changed. The energy in the room was different now. It no longer belonged entirely to the bride in white. For a fleeting second, it belonged to me. Not because I demanded it, not because I stole it, but because I showed up. And something about that, about the act of simply arriving in my skin, uninvited and unapologetic, broke the tension they had been pretending didn't exist. Alana sat frozen at the head table. Her face was unreadable, her champagne glass half raised, her mouth slightly open like she had forgotten what to say next. Her groom turned toward her and then toward me, his brow furrowed. Not with anger, but something else. Uncertainty. Maybe even awe. The photographer, the one who'd emailed me, stood a few feet away with his camera still in his hands, lowered now, like he'd realized he had captured something he hadn't been prepared for. I didn't smile. I didn't wave. I just let them look. I wanted them to see what they had tried to avoid, to feel the weight of what it meant to erase someone before they even entered the room. I wasn't there for revenge. I wasn't there to disrupt. I was there to reclaim space, to let the lenses, the gazes, the silence, all of it, rest on me without shame. And they let it. No one asked me to leave. No one interrupted. The man at the microphone tried to finish his toast, but his words came out slower, less certain, like he was no longer sure where the center of the story was. And for the first time in my life, I felt the full magnitude of being seen, not as a symbol, not as a mistake, not as a lesson, but as a presence. I stood in that room without shrinking, without softening, without apology, and the cameras kept flashing. I didn't plan on speaking. That was never the point. I hadn't rehearsed anything, hadn't written down a single word, but after the silence stretched too long, after the flashes faded and the weight of the room shifted onto my shoulders, I felt something inside me rise, calm, steady, and undeniable. I walked to the edge of the head table, to the same microphone the best man had just used, and reached for it with both hands. My fingers didn't shake. My voice, when it came, was quieter than I expected. But it carried. I didn't name names. I didn't call out anyone. I didn't mention the messages or the photos or the conversations in hushed hallways. I didn't speak of cruelty or exclusion or the long ache of learning how to take up space. I didn't have to. Everyone in that room already knew. Instead, I talked about what it means to show up anyway. What it means to live in a body that people try to edit out. What it means to walk into a place where you are not welcomed. Not because you want to be seen, but because you refuse to keep hiding. I spoke about how easy it is for people to pretend kindness while still upholding silence. How sometimes erasure comes not through violence, but through soft excuses. Through logistics. Through aesthetics. I spoke about beauty. Not the curated kind, but the kind that comes from endurance. from showing up raw and uncovered and still choosing to remain. I told them that I came not to disrupt, but to exist, fully as I am. That I had done nothing more radical than stand in the room, and then I stopped. I stepped back from the microphone and looked around, not with defiance, not even with challenge, just presence, full, unshaken presence. No one moved at first. The stillness was so complete it felt like the room had paused. But then, in the quiet, I heard the sound of a chair sliding back. Then, another. Then more. It wasn't abrupt. It wasn't dramatic. It was reverent. The kind of movement that carries meaning without needing a word. People began to stand. Not all at once. Not in some orchestrated wave. But one by one, as if something in them had been stirred from a place deeper than habit. And then I saw her, Alana. She rose slowly, her hands resting on the edge of the table, like she wasn't quite sure how to balance herself. Her expression was blank, her mouth closed, her eyes following me without blinking. She didn't clap. No one did. That would have made it a performance. This wasn't applause. It was acknowledgement. She looked at me in a way I'd never seen before. Not pity, not distance, not the tight, polite smile she wore in family photos. It wasn't even regret. It was something quieter, something closer to surrender. Like she had finally seen me. Not the version of me she had tried to avoid. Not the complication. Not the girl with the mark. Me. Behind her, the photographer slowly lowered his camera again, and this time he didn't raise it back. I met his eyes briefly. He didn't look away. The room held itself like that for a moment longer, still, silent, present. And then I stepped away. No bow, no smile, no tears. I didn't need them. I had already said everything I came to say by simply walking through the door. The rest had spoken for itself. Outside, the evening air hit my skin like an answer. The kind that doesn't shout, doesn't rush, just lands and stays. I stood beneath the fading light, hearing the music resume behind me through the walls, but it sounded distant now, like a story that no longer needed me to carry it. I didn't need their permission to arrive. I never had. But this time, when I walked out, I didn't feel like I was leaving something behind. I felt like I had taken something back.